Hi, let's get started. Welcome back to the Hot Politics Lab. And we have not one, but two speakers for you today because it's Graduate Friday, which means we'll have two PhD students from across the world who will present their research on roughly the theme of political psychology, the theme that the Hot Politics Lab is all about. Today we have two speakers, Tobias Widmann from the European University Institute and Maaike Homan from the University of Amsterdam, and they will also speak in that order. Each will talk about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a short 10-minute Q&A session with each speaker. And of course, they are all very anxious to hear about your comments to their research. Let me start with introducing the first speaker of today. Tobias Widmann, PhD student at the European University Institute. He's almost ready and he does not want to share with the world yet where he's going next, but it's going to be a great place, I can assure you of that.
And it's not Amsterdam.
It's not Amsterdam. The second best place in the world then. I'm looking forward to this talk because it will be about windmills and the moral, emotional language that is used regarding the discussion on windmills, which is extremely relevant for me personally, because very close to my house, they're planning to build a huge windmill. And even though almost everyone in this neighborhood either votes the Green Left Party or the Animal Rights Party or whatever, they're all opposed to this windmill. So my neighborhood is full with against windmill posters. And I think I'm looking forward to what you have to say about this topic, Tobias. So without further delays, I want to yield the floor to you. And
yeah. All right. Thank you so much. I'm happy I have such a suitable topic then for today. Let me share my screen. I hope you can see my screen. So thank you so much for the opportunity of presenting here today. I'm a PhD student at the European University Institute, and my PhD topic mostly focuses on political rhetoric employed by parties and politicians, with a special focus on emotional rhetoric employed. And this is a work in progress, so I would really like to hear your opinions about it, what you think, some feedback. It's about climate change and the impact of wind turbines on a strategic emotional discourse. So the green issues like environment, climate change, global warming have become more and more salient in recent years. On the one hand, among the public, more and more citizens are concerned about climate change and about the consequences of climate change, but also in political campaigns. So parties increasingly compete over environmental topics. And it has moved from being a balance issue to being a more controversial topic where the ideology shapes party strategies. So, of course, green parties are the clear issue owners here, but there are other party families that increasingly address climate change, that increasingly address the environment as a whole. For example, on the one hand, we have left-wing parties that more and more address green issues because they green parties are a more credible threat to their electoral base, basically, and in order to minimize vote loss, they more and more also address green issues. On the other hand, we have research showing that in many European countries, the radical right, which in the past, of course, mobilizes a lot on immigration, also increasingly discovers the topic of environment as a topic to mobilize support on. And their communication is, of course, largely characterized by skepticism towards climate change, especially towards human-made climate change. And they also directly oppose climate change mitigation policies, for example, renewable energies or wind turbines. So I argue that there's this political conflict over climate change, and the construction of new additional wind turbines might make this political conflict more pronounced. So it increases the salience of climate change, of global warming among the public, and thereby also offers an electoral opportunity for parties to adapt their mobilization strategies and basically maximize the electoral support. Prior research on party competition focused mostly on issue saliency or issue position, but there's also some strand of literature that argues that emotional rhetoric should be taken into consideration here, that parties can use emotional rhetoric strategically. And there's, of course, a growing strand of literature that looks at the usage of emotional appeals. And I would like to make the point also in this paper that I'm presenting here today, that it's also important to look at discrete emotions, because emotions, as you might know, can have diverging political consequences. Especially, for example, when it comes to their relation to morality. And morality and moral emotions have been found to be very important, actually also for climate change, and can persuade people, change opinions. So I'm basically looking here at moral emotions. Moral emotions are emotions that are linked to violations of the social order or the social norms, for example, anger and disgust. And these are the emotions that I'm focusing on in my paper. There are other condemning moral emotions, so they can be used to attack political opponents that are being accused of immoral behavior. And they are also directly linked to a specific moral foundations. So this theory basically assumes that there are 5 different moral foundations that basically determine the moralities in our world, and experiencing certain emotions can strengthen or amplify moral judgments, but mostly specific to moral concerns that are related to the appraisal tendencies of a specific emotion. I can give you an example. For example, disgust is mostly linked to the moral concern of purity. It can be triggered by impure behavior. It can amplify the severity of moral judgments when it comes to impure actions, and can also moralize actions that otherwise would have been considered as immoral. And importantly, disgust is also is mostly related, as I said before, to this kind of purity concern and not to other moral concerns. Anger, on the other hand, another moral emotion, is more linked to other moral concerns, for example, harm or fairness, and predicts stronger moral judgments when it comes to those moral concerns. It also has been found to mobilize people, for example, to fight against justice restoring policies. So a last point that I would make before I come to my hypotheses is that not all moral foundations resonate with everyone, right? So there's this theory that argues that liberals have the moral intuitions primarily based on harm and justice moral concerns. Political conservatives normally use all 5 moral foundations more equally. However, an important point to make is that research shows that purity concern is particularly important when it comes to climate change for conservatives. So in order for moral messages about climate change to be persuasive, the moral concern raised should resonate with the target group. And that brings me to my hypotheses. I have an anger hypothesis where I basically argue that left-wing parties should use anger because it's related to the moral concerns of harm and justice, and they are basically resonating with their more liberal partisan group supporter base. On the other hand, I have the opposite, the different hypothesis for the radical right. That is, I expect also to mobilize against wind turbines, basically using disgust appeals, because this is connected to the moral concern of purity, which resonates better with their partisan base. So to answer those hypotheses, to check those hypotheses, I take a look at the case of Germany, and I use this difference design where I basically perceive the construction of a new wind turbine in an electoral district as treatment. You can see on the left the map of Germany and the different electoral districts, and the ones with the green districts have experienced the construction of at least one new wind turbine. And then I basically connect this information on wind turbines with parliamentary speeches to see how do parliamentary speeches, or how do the speeches of politicians change once a wind turbine has been built in their electoral district. Due to the German electoral system, I can assign MPs, most of the MPs, to specific electoral districts. And then I go swiftly over the analysis. It's basically consists of 3 steps. First of all, I use topic models to identify speeches that address the environment or climate change, because I assume that my hypothesis mostly holds for speeches on climate change or environment. Then I measure emotions using machine learning classifiers that I trained on using crowd coding data that can measure different discrete emotions. And then I use a 2-way fixed effects regression model with actor and time effects to kind of control for unobserved variables and changes over time. So now going to the results. Before I come to the main results, I want to present you what I found with the topic modeling. So this is a lot, but these are basically just different typical topics of debate in parliamentary debates. They range from the European Union, migration to budget discussions. But I also identified two topics that deal with climate change. So this one deals with environment more general. Number 8 talks about forest, water, the environment, but also agriculture. And then the topic number 20 deals more specifically with climate change and renewable energy. If you take a look at how different parties talk about those topics, or to which extent they talk about those topics, you can clearly see the Greens here have the highest salience of, for example, the climate change topic in their speeches, and there are not really significant differences between the other parties. And you can also see how the effect of the treatment, basically you can see that treated MPs are more likely to talk about climate change and renewable energies, which makes sense compared to untreated MPs. Here you can also see how the focus on climate change and like the focus on green issue increases for treated MPs. They are more associated with these green issues, the climate change and the environment, compared to all the other issues. So they're focusing more on these kind of green issues and less on issues such as the welfare, housing, crime, and so on, also migration. Okay, so now I would come to the analysis of the emotional rhetoric and how emotional rhetoric changes once MP is basically treated. You can see here the analysis for two emotions, the anger and for disgust, and for two parties. You can see it for the Greens and for the AfD, which is, I forgot to mention earlier, the radical right party in Germany. So you can see that the Greens are increasing appeals to anger per approximately 1.8% per additional wind turbine, but not for disgust. And you can see the opposite for the AfD, for the radical right party. You can see that they are increasing disgust appeals, but they do not increase anger appeals. So this is kind of confirming what I expected. However, the anger hypothesis is only partly confirmed. I also expected that other left-wing parties would change the emotional rhetoric, but they do not. So this analysis, the results really focusing on the Greens and on the AfD, that the only parties, or the MPs from the only two parties that change their emotional rhetoric. Also, it's only anger and disgust. Other emotions that I measured, for example, fear and sadness, do not change. There's no impact on the usage of fear or sadness. So quickly, before I finish, I also went qualitatively into the data because I wanted to see, those emotional appeals also really link, are they really linked to those moral appeals as I suspected them to be. So for the radical right, I find that they, of course, increase appeals to disgust. They use disgust language such as disgusting, repellent, but also from the moral dimension using words such as betrayal and immoral. But they link those two appeals to the moral concern of purity. This is what I basically expected: the purity of the body, the purity of the mind, but also the purity of the natural order. So they talk about, for example, wind turbines to basically makes people suffer from crueling light reflections, but they also call them animal shredders that are killing millions of birds and insects. They are destroying forests, and they are also destroying the purity of our land. And they are also apparently destroying the purity of our minds, because they turn environmentalists, as they call them, into members of religious cults that are being brainwashed and that are forcing children to participate in, for example, the Fridays for Future movement. So this is like almost like this conspiracy theories. And they call themselves the sole protectors of the natural order of life in our society. So they really frame it in this kind of purity sense, that renewable energy and environmentalists kind of destroy the purity of our land, the purity of our bodies, but also the purity of our minds. On the other side, we have the green framing. They use, of course, words related to anger, angry, mad, furious, but they link those emotional words to more concerns of harm and justice. So they often talk about injustices that are being caused from their political opponents by, for example, delaying the transition to renewable energies. This is like injustice caused to workers, to the economy in general, injustice to people who have to move houses because of coal mining, injustices to the poorest in our country, but also harm that is being done to people around the world For instance, people who then have to flee their countries, and then increasing numbers coming to Europe. And they also talk about harm that is being done to future generations, so to our children, grandchildren, and so on. So to conclude, I find basically the strongest supporters and the strongest opponents of wind turbines go negative. They use moral emotions that are linked to moral concerns that I argue or have been found to resonate with their individual supporter base. This, of course, has implications for public opinion, because arguments combined with moral appeals that resonate among the target group can be highly persuasive. It has implications for voting, for political activism. It can have also implications for a healthy democracy. Negative moral emotions can make politicians appear less open-minded and less worthy of political conversation. It has also been argued that negative moral rhetoric can lead to false polarization. That basically means that differences between ideological camps are perceived as larger than they actually are. So this is basically everything for now. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Tobias. This is great. Now, those of you who are listening and have a question for Tobias, they can type their question in the Q&A box, and then I will read out the question. There's already a question from Christian. So Christian has the right to speak, so he can actually say.
Hey, Tobias. Thanks for the presentation. Really cool stuff. I want to start with a very simple question. How did you choose the topic number for your topic model of 25? It seems very low to me.
It seems very
based on my experience with that data set. It seems very low to me.
Okay.
Based on my experience with the data set.
Okay, I did it basically by trying out different numbers. I mean, there's also this feature in the SDM package that helps you, but it's very hard for me to interpret. I did it basically by trying out different numbers and see if those topics make sense. So if I went below 25, I could see how topics that I would distinguish were mixed into word clusters. If I went above 25, I could see that no new meaningful clusters were added, at least from my interpretation. So I found that the middle way would be the 25, which I found the most meaningful. Yeah, I don't know what your experience is.
I was just surprised because when I was using that with the German pulse speech data, these LDA fit measures like perplexity or log likelihood, they also suggested much higher numbers of topics, like in the range of like 90 or 100 topics.
Okay.
So I'm just curious.
Yeah, so basically mine was basically largely based on my own interpretation of topics and how I thought it's like meaningful clusters. Also, of course, if the clusters become too, or like the topic groups become too small, then I can't, if it's only a few speeches per topic group, then it's of course hard to run analysis on them, because I of course run my analysis only on speeches belonging to the environment and environmental topics. So yeah, but I would take a look into this and see. Thank you so much.
The next question is from Paul Meiners. Very interesting approach. Did you look at the emotional language in all speeches, or only in speeches related to your topic 20, the climate change and environmental topic? Why would wind turbines influence emotional rhetorics on unrelated political topics?
Yeah, so I basically applied the results that you saw in my presentation was only the results for speeches related to environment and climate change. So this is basically a subset of the whole speeches that I have. And I applied, of course, the machine learning classifiers to the whole data set as well. So to speeches that are unrelated to environmental topics. And I do not find any real effects there. Sometimes I find a barely significant coefficient, and I have to look into this if this is somehow related or if this just somehow by accident. I have to take a look into this, but mostly the results are basically very stable only for speeches regarding climate change and environment in general, and not for other topics.
Yes, thank you. The next question is from Matthijs Roduin. Thanks, Tobias. Interesting study. 2 questions. Well, let's do one at a time. You find that other left-wing parties than the Greens do not change their emotional framing. Could that be because they employ an old left strategy? In other words, focused on economic issues.
Mm-hmm. So they increase, I haven't shown this graph in the presentation, but they increase the saliency of environmental topics as well. So I ran this, but if you remember when I showed the results of the topic model, the MPs that were treated did increase the salience of environmental issues. And this, I also ran this analysis by parties, divided by parties, and I can see that the left, especially left-wing parties and the radical right, not mainstream right parties, increase the salience of environmental issues. So they increase the salience of environmental issues, but they do not change the emotional rhetoric. So yeah, if this answers your question.
Yes. Okay. The second question from Matthijs is this: does the AFD also make economic anti-turbine arguments like no money to these crazy wind turbine projects?
I haven't really found, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, they talk about that green energy is inefficient, yes, and therefore a waste of money. They also do those arguments. But really, the majority of the arguments that I found is related to destruction of natural order, or like the destruction of nature destroys forests and kills animals. So the animal focus is very much in the majority of arguments that I find. Many speeches refer to animals being killed by wind turbines, but they also refer to wind energy and renewable energy as unstable, because wind apparently not always blows, and then it creates difficulties for the economy. So this is one part, but I would say by far it's not the focus of far right framing.
Great. Next question is from Isabella Ribasso. Hi, Tobias. Thanks a lot for this presentation. Interesting stuff. I'm wondering this. I assume the Greens are in favor of windmills. What do you suspect is the mechanism that links the construction of windmills to increased anger about climate injustice or poverty? Or is the Green anger a defense to the AfD's opposition to windmills?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So my mechanism that I believe is that wind turbines is, of course, just like wind turbines make the whole debate of climate change, right? And the whole debate of global warming more salient. So it's not only, I believe this anger, because I find this anger also for topic 8, which is not specifically focused on wind turbines, it's environment in general. So it makes the whole, I believe the whole topic of environment more salient. And then the Greens basically, a lot of the anger that came from the Greens was basically to attack their opponents. The government, on the one hand, that is apparently slowing down, because I have to say that the Greens are in opposition in Germany. So they attack the government for slowing down the process of moving to green energy, the transition to green energy. But they also attack the AfD, for example, but also the Liberals. So basically they attack all the other parties for not doing enough, for blocking, for delaying the process of the transition to green and renewable energy. And this is the link basically that they make between anger to the injustice, because this delay in the transition to renewable energy causes injustice, as I presented in the presentation, to people around the world, to future generations, to the poorest in our country. So it's clearly, from what I found, an attack for basically the policy positions of the other parties in parliament.
Yes, the next Gijs has a question.
Yeah, I have 2 comments for you, Tobias. I think
Thanks.
this is a great paper, but and then there are 2 things that I think you should think about, if you haven't done so already, of course. So first, and that's more a response to what you just said. What I don't really get is why treated politicians from the Green Party would be more angry about the lack of government actions than untreated politicians. Wouldn't the untreated politicians actually argue for a windmill in their territory, right? So they should be the ones then more angry, perhaps. Or is it perhaps a problem here that there may not be a lot of Green Party members elected on the local lists, particularly in East Germany, where I also saw a number of untreated politicians, areas, I mean. So that's something to think about. And the second thing is regarding your procedure to go from to first identify topic and then the moral the moral sentiment, the moral emotional language. A potential problem there is that if we assume that each speech is only about one topic, that we're also selecting on the language that on the texts that use wind turbines. Because, for example, I can imagine that somebody would mention wind turbines in passing when discussing geopolitics, right? So you could say like we should build more wind turbines because of the geopolitical situation and we don't want to be dependent on Russia, etc. So that's an argument for wind turbines, but that speech may end up in the geopolitics section and thereby remains unanalyzed.
Okay, so basically then I should basically not only take those two topic groups into consideration, right, in my analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I think much easier, or at least as a robustness check, you could see if you just simply look for wind turbine mentions.
Yeah, so basically more using like a list of keywords. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. This is really great. One comment about the treated and the untreated. You're right. I haven't actually thought about it in this way at all. The way I saw it was that receiving treatment increases the salience of these issues in the mind of the public, and therefore parties adapt their mobilization strategies, their rhetoric, and so on. But you're right. I have to look into this. Thank you so much.
Christian, you also had another question?
Some of it was actually covered by what Gijs just said, but I was also wondering about the geographic clustering of MPs.
Mm-hmm.
So aren't most AfD MPs that come from the local lists clustered in East Germany, and most
so the thing is
Green MPs clustered in West Germany, and might that influence it? And my other comment would be, wouldn't it make probably more sense to select speeches based on the agenda of the debate?
Sorry, I didn't understand the last one.
Wouldn't it be easier to select speeches based on the agenda of the debate? So you would basically look at all the speeches of a day that covers the topic of energy or wind turbines, instead of just picking speeches that directly mention or are directly clustered or directly classified as being about wind turbines by your topic model.
But why do you think that would make a difference, if I may ask?
Because I assume that speeches that are before or after a speech that is classified as being about wind turbines will also be about wind turbines, even without mentioning the word wind turbines or any technical reference to wind turbines.
Yeah, I'll take a look into that. Yeah, thank you. And about the East-West differences. So the thing is, I have not only chosen the political the MPs that have won a direct electoral district, because it's like this first past poll system for the electoral district, but also MPs that made it into the parliament anyways, for example, via the state lists, and then were still assigned to, because they are still assigned to a home district. So I also have AfD politicians in Western Germany. But you're right, I should include probably a control for the East-West differences. This is already on my list, and I will do it next. Thank you so much.
Great. I think with that said, we'll go over to the next speaker, Maaike Homan. Gijs, do you introduce Maaike?
What should I say? We all know her. I think Maaike is the person with the most presentations in the Hot Politics Lab, which is of course meant as a compliment. And I also know for sure that she has heard our comments on what she will present many, many times. So I think she's particularly looking forward what other people think of this. So for those of you who haven't seen Maaike yet, she's a PhD student in the Hot Politics Lab at the University of Amsterdam, and I will, yeah, I'll just yield the floor to you, Maaike.
Yes, thanks, Gijs. I will share my screen. Can you see it? Yes. Okay. Yes. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I'm PhD at the Hot Politics Lab, and another presentation for me again. Now, not about mimicry, but about something different. So my PhD project mostly focuses on how people respond to the emotions of politicians, and especially nonverbal communication and nonverbal expressions of emotions. And in a previous study, I've really looked at emotional contagion and mimicry, so how people respond emotionally. And I always got the question, what about gender of the politician? Does it play a role? So I also was very intrigued by that question. And in a course I was teaching, I had some students who were also interested in that. So we run a pilot study and also an actual study. And I will show some results of that study. And I will present a pre-analysis plan of a second study. So yeah, I hope you can give me some useful feedback. Yeah, so the project is about perception of emotions of female versus male politicians. So yeah, I probably don't have to tell that a lot of female politicians receive a lot of negative criticism when showing emotions, or too little emotions or too much emotions. Especially in social media, everyone has a lot of attention and focus on these emotions shown by female politicians. And also in literature, they found that people often have these negative reactions to female politicians showing especially dominant emotions, so such as anger, but also disgust or contempt. And so when female politicians show, for example, anger, people generally perceive it as less appropriate. They evaluate the politician as lower, less competent, and they attribute it to their personality instead of the situation, like the debate. And yeah, in general, when female politicians show emotions or don't show emotions, they're often criticized of being too emotional or really too cold. So a lot of negative reactions. There's also a study by Brooks, and that shows that in general, in her study, she finds that there's not a difference between male and female politicians, that if both show anger or sadness, that people penalize them at same levels. But they found an effect specifically for women. So women punish female candidates for showing yeah, a lot of these emotions, anger, but also sadness. So in general, there's a lot of negative reactions to these emotions expressed, and we want to investigate and examine this more, and especially look at, take sort of a step back and see whether this is already present in like really the perception of this emotion. So do we already, when we just see a female politician or a male politician, does our yeah, biases already influence how intense we perceive these emotions, and does this maybe then also lead to all the negative criticism? So yeah, in general, if you look into the psychology literature, there is already a bias in gender, in emotion perception and gender. So men in general are perceived as angrier than women, and women are often perceived as more happy. So say you have a man and a woman, and they're displaying both an angry expression, but the same level of intensity. In general, people perceive the anger of the man more intense, is angrier than a woman. And the same goes for happiness, but then mostly for women. And this link between angry men and happy women has been found in all kinds of different studies using different methods. And there's basically two sort of explanations. So the first one is that facial features overlap with expression. So men often have more masculine features in their face, so thicker and lower eyebrows, and that's also more closer related to the anger expression. Whereas for women, they have more baby face features, more feminine faces, more rounded faces, and that is more similar to happy expression. And then, of course, there's this other explanation Of course, the stereotype that we have about men and women also play a role how we expect them to behave. And also emotions are, of course, especially anger is really a signal of dominance, whereas happiness is more of a signal of affiliation and warmth. So therefore, in general, men are seen as more dominant and in more higher hierarchy roles, that there's also this expectation or acceptance that they show anger, whereas women are, it's less accepted to show anger, but more happiness and warm and more sociable signals and emotions. So a lot of this work is done by Ursula Hess and colleagues, and she also has this model in one of her papers, and she basically says it's just not just only the gender, but it's actually perceptions of dominance that is mediating this bias in this emotion perception. So being a woman, you have more feminine features, which makes the perceptions of you less dominant, which makes other people think that you are less expected to show anger. And then the question is, in politics, women and men have both high status. So what if the perceptions of dominance or the information about dominance is different? So men and women are the same level of dominance. How does this then influence our emotion perception? And so this general emotion bias, we suspect that it will change when both men and women are in the similar dominant position. So in some studies, they find that when you use the same faces, same facial features, but different hairstyles to indicate gender, the women are actually perceived angrier. And in a study, a vignette study, in which they describe a woman or a man in a dominant or non-dominant position, in general, they expect similar levels of anger when both men and women are in the same dominant position. So there could be, instead of this men angry, happy, women happy, it could be the case that when they're in dominant position, it sort of changes, it becomes equal, or women are perceived as more angry. And also just based on all these negative reactions that especially female politicians get, yeah, it's probably could be that female politicians are perceived as more angry, since it's against the stereotype. And therefore, people are very sensitive to this violation of the stereotype, and therefore also perceive it as more intense compared to men. So we did a pilot study with some students who did a great job on that, and we found very interesting results. So we found it in, we just also showed neutral expressions, both male and female politicians, and then we found no difference in anger perception. But when the male and female politicians looked angry, so in the anger condition, we found that female politicians were perceived as more angry than male politicians. So that's why we formulated these hypotheses. And we also wanted to look into, in the big study, this on MTurk, we wanted to see whether the participant gender also would play a role. So what we did is we ran a study on Amazon Turk, 195 participants. We took portrait pictures of the UK members of parliaments and House of Lords, which are really good quality pictures with good copyright issues here, so you're allowed to use them and manipulate them. And what we did is we selected politicians that look neutral on their original picture. And we also checked it with Face Reader, whether Face Reader would also recognize it as neutral. And then what we did is we manipulated the action units. I've talked already always about action units, so I hope you all know what that means. So all these different muscles in the face, and we manipulated those that are related to anger. And we had 10 female politicians and 10 male politicians. And we added 2 pictures of politicians smiling, so that it was not so clear that we were really looking into just neutral and angry expressions, just to disguise our interest. So we had a pool of pictures, and we made sure that the neutral picture was not, the same politician was not seen in both neutral or angry. So if it was already seen in the neutral condition, it would not appear in the angry condition. And then, participants rated the pictures on a scale, slider scale, which we took from Ursula Hess's work on different emotions. So in the neutral condition, we actually find that there's no difference between anger perception. So you find more the general emotion bias, in gender bias in emotion perception. So what you can see is that men are perceived really neutral and women mostly more happy. And if we go to the angry condition, we see that the pictures, the anger condition are perceived as more angry. The manipulation of the anger is quite subtle. So therefore it's not like a full-blown anger expression, it's subtle so that it still looks realistic. Therefore, also the anger scores are not super high. And also besides that, anger is of course also an emotion and it's harder to recognize than, for example, happiness, which is just basically a smile. So often what you see is that when people rate these anger expressions, they also rate it quite high on other negative emotions. But interestingly, what we can see is that not men are seen as more angry, what is expected from like the non-dominant literature in psychology, but it's actually equal based on these means. And what we see, for example, for disgust, that female politicians are rated as more looking more disgusting or expressing more disgust, and that men are perceived as showing more sadness, which is actually interesting because that's also the other way around, because normally disgust is an emotion that's more easily recognized in men because it's also more masculine emotion, and sadness is more a submissive, vulnerable emotion, so more recognized with women. So there you see actually sort of this flip of this effect in the emotion perception. So based on the means, you can see that their anger is actually perceived equally. But what we found is that a lot of different politicians are rated quite differently. So some are low on anger, but some are really high on anger. Still, all the anger pictures were rated more angry than the neutral pictures. So what we wanted to do is control for just the individual politicians. And there, if we do that, we actually find a very strong effect of politicians, female politicians, being perceived as more angry than men. And we don't find an effect of gender, the participants. And yeah, just a side note, I also calculated the facial width height ratio. So that's also an index of how dominant a face is perceived based on this, or index on the facial features. So often a high facial width height ratio is related to higher dominance perceptions. And we see indeed that male politicians with have a correlation with this ratio of 0.42. So it's really high. So the higher this ratio, which is an indication of dominance, so the higher this facial feature, the more angry they look, which is high for men, but for women you see it's quite low. And there it could be that actually the perception of dominance is mostly driven by the fact that they're a politician. So just an interesting side note. The limitations of this study, we are not sure whether it was really clear that our participants realized that they were looking at politicians. So therefore we want to improve that. And secondly, we think when we also look at the difference between the neutral condition and the angry condition and how like the difference in anger perception, we see in general that female politicians score higher in that difference score, but it's only a small difference, and we based our effect size to calculate the power for the study on quite a medium effect size, but we think that it might be a smaller effect size than we anticipated. So therefore, we think it's good to have a more powerful sample. So for the second study, we want to run it probably again on mTurk with a bigger sample. And in this case, we really want to emphasize that it's about politicians. And what we want to do is have another condition in which we compare non-politicians and politicians to really see that if you use the same pictures and present them and in a non-dominant position, or at least just ordinary individuals, that then men in general would be perceived as more angry, whereas when we put them in both men and women in a dominant position, so say that they're both politicians, that then this flips or changes. So therefore we have a politician condition and non-politician condition for female and male. And then we want to do between subjects, because the pictures are then really similar. So we don't want to make sure that people are really don't really notice that basically the same people are used, but then for one are politicians and one are supposedly not politicians. So yeah, we want to make sure that is clear. And what we thought is that some of these, it's really our portrait pictures. So you see with especially the men in the suits. So what we thought would be better is to really crop the face, as I have an example here. So I hope you can also tell me whether if I present these pictures as non-politici, but just normal people, whether this is convincing. And we want to use the same set of stimuli to really replicate, or at least keep the design as simple as possible, so that we can really figure out whether, what is actually going on. Is it equal levels of anger perception, or are women actually perceived more angry? So yeah, I'm happy and look forward to your feedback, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Maaike. As Gijs already indicated, we have given a lot of comments already on this project. So ideally, to open the floor here for other people to ask their questions to Maaike. You can do this by typing your question in the Q&A box. In the meantime, I might be also looking at Tobias or Christian if they already have a question.
I do have a clarification question.
Sure.
On this one graph, you showed that men are perceived as more sad, right? And what was the explanation again that you gave? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so in general, the idea is that once men and women are in similar dominant positions, then emotions that are typically male are more perceived when both men and women are in the same. So normally, sadness is an emotion that's more perceived by women, or more expressed by women, because it's sadness is sort of a sign of vulnerability. So you would think that men in general show that less. So the idea is when you put both of them in the same position, then the stereotypical behaviors, such as showing sadness for men, it becomes then sort of heightened, I think. But the underlying process is still quite difficult to grasp still, but there seems to be some sort of flipping of emotion perception once the level of dominance is changed.
Okay, thank you, Tobias. There's a question from Patrick Stewart. Welcome, Patrick. Good morning to you. This is so very cool. I have a question regarding the AUs, or action units, manipulated, and to what level. Relatedly, do you think that men and women have different anger repertoires? So 2 questions, Maaike. One is what action units have you manipulated, and to what extent? And the second question is there maybe a different anger for men and women? Yeah,
great questions. Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Yeah, so I have to really think hard which action units I manipulated, because there's so many. But I especially manipulated the action units that are really most pronounced with anger. So the ones with the eyebrows, and really also the corrugator muscle, basically. What I did is I have these, you have this program called Face Gen, in which you can really alter these action units. And I based it on just basically Paul Ekman's work for anger. And so basically the eyebrows, but also pressed lips. Those were, I think, most visible. I also manipulated something with eyelids, but I don't think you can really see that. What we did is that most of the pictures are all manipulated in the same level. So you can create a continuum with this program WebMorph from completely not angry to very angry. And what we did is that we tried to manipulate, push it so far until it would not be realistic anymore, but all around the intensity of 50%. So that's all pictures, with some are maybe 51 and some are a little bit lower or higher. but that is basically how we manipulated the anger. And yeah, the second question, whether there's differences in the repertoire of anger, I think definitely yes. In general, anger can be expressed in so many different ways. So I think there's also some studies showing that men in general show really this, maybe this expression and also in voice, and women do more by in their language, or at least don't express it as much, but can still experience the similar levels of anger. Yeah, so that, yeah, there might be different ways in which people express anger, and there might be also gender differences in that. But in this study, yeah, we wanted to, of course, make it sort of comparable. That's why we use this kind of method. But yeah, anger it's a complex emotion, especially in expression, non-verbal expression, because it's not just only the expression. You can express it in different ways. But I hope in this way, with the action units, it's still a way to capture this bias in emotion perception.
Okay. Next question is from Tobias Gorbach. Super interesting. Nicole Bauer argues that stereotype activation acts as a mechanism triggering, or not, gender stereotypical evaluations. Maybe the explicit reference to politicians prevents stereotype activation to some degree. Tobias is wondering what your thoughts are on this.
Oh yeah, great question. And I'll definitely look up also that literature. Yeah, so I think indeed that's also what some of these, I think Brooks said, that the fact that that sort of status overrules maybe the general stereotype of emotion expression and gender. So indeed, just the fact that you say these are politicians, this might lead to a different stereotype and overrule maybe the salience of this gender difference. And I'm also definitely, now I'm thinking of it, I should also look into the general stereotype of male versus female politicians. And yeah, it's indeed a good question or comment. And I do think that's sort of also part of the mechanism, that's indeed the stereotype of politicians sort of overrules the stereotype of general emotion perception and gender.
Okay, there's still some time for additional questions.
Can I fill up the time with a quick question?
Yes, absolutely, guys.
You looked at facial width to height ratio, and before you also looked at I forgot the exact name, but something like something femininity of the face. These are not the same, right? Do they actually correlate, or?
I haven't checked it. It was just more that I found this facial width height ratio in this program yesterday. I thought like, hey, just let's see what that is. But yeah, so I also have used previously a measure of masculinity, and this is based on someone, a colleague of the one that created, the researcher created the WebMorph, so where you can manipulate these emotions. And in that, it's an R package called FaceFun, and there you can calculate based on the facial landmarks how masculine and feminine. And I think that's different because it takes into account, for example, the roundness of the face and thickness of eyebrows and big eyes versus small eyes, that kind of stuff. Whereas this ratio takes into account really the width and the height of this part of the face, this triangle of the face. So I think it's different, but it probably should be correlated because both are like the higher score, the more perceived dominance people see. So yeah. So that's why also I'm interested in including these also with the data, just to see what the relationships are and what it does to the perception effect.
I also have a question, Maaike. Your other study that you've presented here a couple of times in facial mimicry shows that partisanship is an important factor conditioning the extent to which we mimic politicians. Now you say, yeah, the question I always got was gender, but are we not missing here in this equation partisanship? Because, yeah, people don't know what these politicians are. You deliberately chose them. It's well designed to take politicians from another country. But what if partisanship comes in? And I'm thinking about, how did people look at Hillary when she cried, or Angela Merkel in terms of maybe the lack of emotional expression. So,
yeah, no.
What should we expect here? Are we now looking at an effect that is actually not there once we factor in partisanship, or is it only among your in party?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And it's also a question for my third paper, basically. So there's this also a bias in emotion perception versus in-group versus and out-group people. So if you see someone from your in-group, you're more likely to, you're more accurate in emotion perception, and you're more likely to rate them the emotion more positively. And the other way around for out-party members. So yeah, definitely with this in-party, out-party, it of course will play a huge effect. And that's also why I left it out in this study, because I really wanted to focus on the gender effect. We did control for ideology, but it didn't have really a ideology of the politician, but it didn't really have an effect. And so it would be super interesting to see, to include this in-party, out-party effect and gender, and see what then would be the interaction. So whether then, well, I can imagine that if you really like, for example, Hillary Clinton, and she's very angry, that since she's a woman, you might perceive her as more angry. But on the other hand, because you really support her, and anger is also a sign of passion, you might actually really be happy with that. So it's interesting to see what then the perception also would show. So interesting question, and to be continued thing.
Great. Gijs, do you want to wrap up? I think we're...
Yeah, we're out of time. Thanks a lot, Maaike. Looking forward to the results of that second study. Actually, third study already, right? Let's. Christian asked whether this will be your 10th coffee mug from the Hot Politics Lab.
But I still have mine here.
Yeah. Okay. So okay, but if it's broken, you can replace it, or maybe you can get one for your partner. That And Tobias, of course, you will get a Hot Politics coffee mug as well. I don't have an example with me currently, but I was in my office this week for the first time in a year, and they're still all there. So, well, I think so. I didn't actually count, but so everyone should be getting one at one point in time. Okay, let me spend like 1 minute on announcing the remainder of the schedule for this academic year. I have to disappoint you. The next 2 weeks, there's no Hot Politics Lab because Bert and I need to take some vacation. And there are a bunch of public holidays as well. So 21st of May will be our next meeting with Cameron Brick, who's a psychologist, expert with expertise in climate psychology. So that's what he will talk about. And then the week after, 28th of May, we have a Hot Politics Graduate Friday session again with Nora Schulte talking on the psychopathology of terrorists, and with Robin Chuchel. And okay, he just left the building. I just wanted to ask him what his topic would be, but I think it will also be like Tobias, close to Tobias's presentation today. And then the week after, June 4th, we have Loes Aaldering from the Free University of Amsterdam giving a talk. June 11, we have a to be confirmed speaker. June 18th, we have the best presentation of the year. It will be me talking about using psychophysiology in political science. And then the week after that, we'll have the last meeting of the year with a whole bunch of presentations from the brain and cognition interns that we currently have running around in the lab. And they will present various experiments that they're doing with using EEG measures and all kinds of different interesting aspects of politics. So that's going to be a great end of the year. And hopefully also soon we'll start to communicate to you the program for next year. Okay, that's it for today. It's 4 already, and I want to wish you a great weekend and a good spring break if that's up for you, right? Okay, see you.